So Kurt.
Yeah.
So it seems that you are ready for the presentation. So before we start this side event, let me introduce you to the audience here about your background a little bit. And I try to skip a lot of your long list of history. And I just like to emphasize that Professor Kurt is now the Secretary General of the League of European Research Universities. And certainly he's been the long distinguished professor serving as once served as the Dean of the Law School in Leuven University in Belgium to organize the Asian and European Legal Forum on Climate Change. And this year, we just finished that forum in Finland, which means that Professor Kurt is now as a visiting scholar in Finland, the Helsinki University. So next, I would like to invite Professor Kurt to give us.
My presentation this afternoon will deal with the EU Net Zero Industry Act. And the Net Zero Industry Act is one of the many legislative initiatives that the European Commission has brought to the table over the past 4 years in the framework of what we call in Europe the Green Deal. And the Green Deal is not an environmental program, it's not a climate program, but it is a program which is trying to introduce a new economic model in the European Union, a new economic model which is driven by sustainability and which is driven by climate neutrality. So as a consequence of that, the EU has developed a series of legislative acts which has to realize as soon as possible this European Green Deal. And the EU Net Zero Industry Act is one of those legislative initiatives. It's still a legislative initiative because it has not been adopted yet. The European Commission has put the proposal for this act forward in March of this year. Earlier this month, the European Parliament has given its opinion about this proposal by the European Commission. And now the expectation is that in the month of December, so this month, which just started today, that they hope to reach an agreement between the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers, which are the representatives of the 27 member states of the Union on this act. And it's clear, as always, when the Commission formulates a proposal, the European Parliament comes up with all kinds of amendments. Also, the member states come up with all kinds of amendments. But at the end of the day, it are the Parliament and the Council, the representatives of the member states, which have to reach agreement on a joint text which both of them adopt. So the question is if that is going to happen next month, because time is running out for the adoption of this act, because you probably know that in Europe, in the European Union, we are heading for European Union elections, for elections of the European Parliament, which will take place early June of next year. But the consequence of that is that the institutions, the Parliament and the Council, normally stop their legislative initiatives and activities somewhere in March, latest April. So it's really essential that an agreement is reached between the Parliament and the Council on this act somewhere, let's say, at the latest by the end of January 2024. Now, why has the European Commission in March of this year put forward this act? Well, the Commission has put forward this act because it has become clear in the European Union that events like the COVID-19 pandemic, like the energy crisis, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have exposed a number of dependencies for the European Union, which can harm the competitiveness of the EU industry. And if my colleague in Dubai can go to slide 4 of my presentation, there you will see a number of dependencies which the EU has been encountering over the past months with the emergence of the events that I just have mentioned. And the dependencies that I want to refer at are, for example, the fact that more than 90% of the solar photovoltaic wafers and certain other PV technology components are imported from China, that more than 1/4 of electric cars and batteries are imported from China, and that China accounts for 90% of global investments in net zero technology manufacturing facilities. So it's clear that the EU is running a number of risks because of those dependencies with regard to clean technology. And so if the goal is that we want to make Europe an industrial base for net zero technologies, and if we want to increase the European Union's manufacturing capacity, it is essential to avoid those harmful dependencies and to meet the EU's ambitious climate and energy targets. That's why this Net Zero Industry Act was put forward to create a simpler and more predictable legal framework for net zero industries in the EU as part of what I already mentioned, Europe's Green Deal and the industrial plan, which is part of this European Union Green Deal. If this act is approved, it will support the EU's climate neutrality commitment for 2050 and the clean energy transition. It will also strengthen the resilience of the European Union's energy system and contribute to establishing a secure supply of clean energy in line with what we call the Repower EU package. All of this is driven by the fact that the European Union sees a number of net zero technology trends which are quite crucial for the EU. The net zero technology global market is worth about 600 billion euros per year by 2030. The EU's net zero ecosystem doubled in value from 2020 to 2021, reaching presently 100 billion euros. The deployment of renewables will nearly quadruple by 2050. The deployment of heat pumps will increase sixfold by 2050. And the global production of electric vehicles will increase 15-fold by 2050. So all of this are the reasons why the EU is embarking on this EU Net Zero Industry Act and policy. So what are the ambitions now? And if you can go to the next slide of my presentation, what are the EU ambitions now for the net zero technologies? Well, the legislation which is proposed should help scale up net zero technology manufacturing in the EU to provide at least 40% of the EU's annual deployment needs for strategic net zero technologies by 2030. And obviously, for that to realize, we need a simplification of the regulatory framework for net zero technologies. We need scaling up manufacturing of net zero technologies, and we need the fostering of competitive and resilient European net zero industry. So this is the ambition which is translated in this Net Zero Industry Act. And the act, as a consequence, as it was proposed by the European Commission, and I will come back to that later on in my presentation when I speak about the position of the European Parliament. But originally in March, the European Commission supported through this act, in particular, strategic net zero technologies that are commercially available or soon to enter the market and have significant potential for rapid scale up to contribute to the EU's decarbonization targets. I'm at this point in time, I'm at slide 3 of my presentation. I don't know if you see that page. Yes, I think that we still can move one forward if somebody can do that, because then you will see what are the strategic net zero technologies on the next slide that have been put forward initially in March of this year by the European Commission. It are solar photovoltaic and solar thermal, sustainable biogas and biomethane, heat pumps and geothermal energy, electrolyzers and fuel cells, batteries and storage, grid technologies, offshore wind and offshore renewables, and finally, carbon capture and storage. These are the so-called strategic net zero technologies which were put forward by the European Commission in March of this year. Next to those 8 strategic net zero technologies, the Commission also indicated other net zero technologies which also could be supported by the measures which are included in the Act. And those other net zero technologies included sustainable alternative fuels technologies, advanced technologies to produce energy from nuclear processes with minimal waste from the fuel cycle, small modular reactors, and related best-in-class fuels. So you see that already in March, a huge amount of technologies were put forward. The 8 strategic ones that you see with the logos on the slide that you have in front of you, this was the strategic group of 8, and then a number of other net zero technologies which also could be supported. You are one slide too far, so if you could go back to the previous slide, then we are at the same pace in the presentation. So with regard to those technologies, the Commission proposed in March of this year to develop a number of actions to stimulate the investment in the European Union into those net zero technologies. And here we have also for us as lawyers a number of very important proposals which were made by the Commission. On the one hand, the Commission proposes to set up net zero strategic projects, which would be priority projects essentially for reinforcing the resilience and the competitiveness of the EU net zero industry. So a number of projects to be launched, subsidized, supported financially by the Union. Secondly, the Commission also proposed to set forward a CO2 injection capacity target. The whole discussion on carbon capture and storage is still going on in Europe at this point in time. We already have a legislative framework for that since more than a decade. But as in many other parts of the world, CCS has remained absolutely underdeveloped. Well, now the Commission wants to change this, and so carbon capture and storage projects will be supported, notably by enhancing the availability of CO2 storage sites. How this will work out, nobody knows at this point in time, but at least that's the action that is put forward by the Commission. Thirdly, the Commission also wants to facilitate access to markets, and she's going to do that by sustainability and resilience criteria in procurement procedures and auctions to help boost the demand of renewables. You all know that the European Union is investing heavily in renewables, and so this is another example of this support for renewable energy in the European Union. Now, at the same time, the Commission is also very much aware of the fact that all those activities and actions that she wants to put in the market will need skilled people. And that's why a bit surprising in such an act which is put forward by the Commission, in this act, also the creation of net zero industry academies are put forward with the aim to support and oversight by the Net Zero European platform to provide training and education on net zero technologies and lead to quality job creation. You know that many of the jobs which you have presently in society in the next few decades many of those jobs will disappear, and the jobs and the skilled people that we need for this sustainable climate neutral society of 2050 are still not there. So investments have to be made there. For us lawyers, the fifth priority or the fifth action, which is put forward by the Commission in March 2023, is absolutely key, namely cutting red tape and accelerated permitting, which is in Europe, in the European Union, nowadays, of course, a nightmare. The legal procedures which are put forward over the past few years to permit all kinds of installations, activities, industries, and things like that, all have to suffer from very long procedures, a lot of appeals against delivered permits, a lot of judicial protection claimed by interest groups and things like that. So obtaining a permit for example, a renewable energy park has become really a serious headache for anybody who wants to invest in this kind of clean technology. But this act, like already a number of other acts have indicated over the past year, now it's really serious for the Commission to cut the red tape and to accelerate the permitting procedures. So we need lower administrative burden for the developing of net zero manufacturing projects and simple and faster permitting procedures, in particular for the strategic projects which will benefit from even faster permitting to increase planning and investment certainty. So the Act indicates all kinds of timelines, which at this point in time, certainly in my own country, Belgium, would be considered to be absolutely unrealistic, in a sense that delivering permits within a year and a half or something like that, even delivering some permits at the end of an appeal procedure within 3 years can already be quite a challenge. So it's very easy for the Commission, of course, to write something like that in a proposal for an act. The whole question is when the member states will have to implement this legislation on cutting red tape and accelerating the permitting procedures, how this is going to be realized at the end of the day. And finally, two other actions which are put forward in the proposal of the Commission is the creation of a Net Zero Europe platform and the creation of what we call regulatory sandboxes to help develop and test innovative net zero technologies and create a level playing field for innovation. So on the next slide, you see that this net zero industry platform that I just mentioned will be a kind of consultation platform between the European Commission and the member states, with the purpose to coordinate and discuss the several actions that I just have mentioned. Now, the Commission also will make sure that industry representatives and other experts can be invited to that platform. So this, in a nutshell, is in fact what the European Commission proposed in March of this year, and which then went into the normal decision-making process within the European Union, namely that a proposal by the European Commission must be advised by the European Parliament, must be advised by the member states, the Council, and at the end of the day, then the Council and the Parliament have to come to an agreement on one text that they would like to adopt. So what happened over the past few months? The European Parliament looked into this proposal of the European Commission, and the relevant committee within the European Parliament is the Industry, Technology and Research Committee of the European Parliament, which came up with an advice on the 25th of October of this year. So hardly a little bit more than a month ago. And then on the 21st of November, so it's something like 10 days ago, the plenary European Parliament then adopted its position on this Net Zero Industry Act. And I must say that this position adopted by the Parliament is quite surprising, because the Parliament has come up with a substantive list of amendments on the text. And probably the most important amendment is the list of net zero technologies which should be supported in the European Union in view of Europe's transition to a climate neutral economy by 2050. As I indicated to you just a few minutes ago, we had those 8 key strategic technologies, which then in a kind of second list would also be supplemented by a number of other net zero technologies, which also could get support. But what the European Parliament now has done, the European Parliament has thrown overboard this distinction between the 8 strategic and the other net zero technologies. And the European Parliament now has decided to support the development of 17 technologies which are deemed essential for Europe's transition to a climate neutral economy by 2050. On the next slide of my presentation, you will see the leading member of the European Parliament, who was the rapporteur for this Net Zero Industry Act, Christian Ehler, a German Christian Democrat, who is one of the lead persons in the European Parliament on research and innovation. And obviously, he's very much involved also with everything that deals with clean technology, new technologies, net zero emissions, net zero industry, and things like that. So they made, with the ITRE committee first and later with the plenary EP, they made a kind of tabula rasa of this list as proposed by the European Commission. And now they put forward 17 technologies which they deem essential for Europe's transition to a climate neutral economy by 2050. So in this new list of 17, the nuclear technology comes back as being equal to those other 16 net zero technologies which are now included in the list by the European Parliament. And this future technologies in the nuclear sector, like small modular reactors, are, of course, very high on the agenda of many European Union member states because of the energy crisis that we have been experiencing now over the past 2 years. The search for cheap, clean energy is, of course, enormous. And a number of countries, like mine, Belgium, have reviewed their strategic or their strategy vis-a-vis nuclear energy over the past 2 years. For example, my country decided to prolong the operation of 2 nuclear installations for another 10 years because of this issue of clean and cheap energy for the future. Now, the whole question will be, of course, if this list of 17 technologies will survive the negotiations which now will have to start between the European Parliament and the European Council of Ministers. Several people have already indicated that a list of 17 technologies is probably a bit too much. Some people say with 17 technologies, countries, the 27 member states of the Union, can choose which technology that they consider as being strategic. Some people say the choice for strategic technologies will depend on the geographical situation of member states. And obviously, investing in renewable, in solar, for example, or in hydro, of course, depends to a certain extent on the kind of country that you are. For example, here in Finland, well, heavily investing in solar is probably something that you shouldn't do, because if you look at the amount of sunshine that we get here on a yearly basis, then obviously this is not going to be a very attractive commercial proposition. But if you do that in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, in Portugal, whatever, of course, that's a completely different story. But if you would talk about hydro, then obviously a country like Finland certainly would be performing much better on hydro, like all the other Scandinavian countries, than, for example, my own country, which is a pure flat country, Belgium, like the Netherlands, where obviously hydro is not really a kind of viable economic option that we have. So this discussion of having 17 net zero technologies is to a certain extent justified, because obviously it depends on the geographical situation of specific countries. But on the other hand, it's also a question of investments that one wants to do for a number of those other technologies. Nonetheless, a number of people consider this 17 list of 17 technologies like a kind of, and I quote now a number of MEPs, which said it's like a shopping list, or even a number of them said last week, taking into account the time of the year that we are, that the European Parliament came up with a Christmas wish list on net zero technologies. So we will have to see how this develops over the next few weeks. As I already said in the beginning of my talk, the Parliament and the Council now will enter into negotiations, which we call the so-called trilogues. And those trilogues have to take place in a number of weeks. Unfortunately, now there will be the Christmas break in between those several meetings where the Council and the Parliament will have to reach an agreement. And a lot of people expect that there are 2 technologies which will lead to heavy negotiations, difficult negotiations, because they are included in this list of 17. And that's on the one hand, the nuclear technology, as I already mentioned. Still in Europe, there is a significant opposition to nuclear energy in a number of countries and in a number of specific political parties. Although we all now see, taking into account the energy crisis, how important nuclear energy can be. So that's one technology which is highly disputed. Second technology which is highly disputed is everything dealing with carbon capture and storage. Also there, we see that certainly the green parties and a number of environmental groups in Europe are certainly not supportive of the idea that we should invest a lot and do a lot with carbon capture and storage. And so also the expectation is that this technology, its inclusion in the list of 17, could endanger the timely conclusion of this file. Probably a number of member states are going to play this very hard and certainly will want to have nuclear or carbon capture and storage into the list of the 17 technologies which are presented and proposed by the European Parliament. So this is in a nutshell the most important elements that I wanted to mention with regard to the Net Zero Industry Act. But we shouldn't forget that next to this Net Zero Industry Act, there are many other legislative proposals still pending or nearing the end of the adoption procedure. There is, for example, also the recently adopted Critical Raw Materials Act, where the European Union wants to make sure that it is doing much more with regard to a number of critical raw materials that we would need in a sustainable, climate neutral society in 2050. So also there, the Commission has made a proposal last year, which is now adopted by the EU, to speed up the development of mining again in Europe, mining for those critical raw materials. Also, this act is accompanied by a lot of criticism and a lot of opposition by groups, by political parties, because obviously mining activities, something that we haven't seen in continental Europe, certainly for the past decades, is something that from an environmental point of view, of course, is problematic. And in order to circumvent even its own applicable legislation, the EU says that in a number of cases, those mining activities can be labeled as being of a public interest, as a consequence of which it's much easier to deviate from existing environmental protection legislation at EU level. For example, the Habitats and the Wild Birds Directive or the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive and things like that. So all those legislative initiatives are developed in order to reach this sustainable and climate neutral society in 2050, but at the same time is also driven by an enormous agenda of strategic autonomy, being dependent on the rest of the world is something that the EU doesn't want to do anymore. And for example, this critical raw materials, there, of course, we are depending to a large extent on China and a number of other players at a global level. And so I expect that the next European Parliament, which is going to be elected in June of next year, and the next European Commission, which will be composed by, let's hope, December of next year, will have as a kind of central agenda and policy action point Europe's strategic autonomy. So in a nutshell, that's what I wanted to say. dear friends, obviously happy to take questions or any other interactions as you see fit.
Sure, thank you very much. I know that Kurt, you can always give us, but you can always give us a very concise description about a new developed legislation. And first of all, do you think that it's still got out of the barrier to overcome before the act could really be enforceable? Is that right? This takes a while. Do you think they can really pass that by the end of this year?
Yeah, well, it's not going to be the end of this year, but the deadline is more or less the end of January next year. So we still have,
I see.
Let's say, 2 months, December and January, to get this done. The deal between the European Parliament and the Council will have to be made in this slot of 2 months that we now have. And as I indicated in my talk, I think that what can still blow up the deal is the opposition vis-a-vis a number of technologies like nuclear or CCS. And
okay.
The only question is, how hard are a number of countries going to play this? Because the Parliament is clearly in favor of those 17, and it has left the choice of technology to the member states to label them as being strategic for country X or being strategic for country Y or being strategic for country Z. The whole question is the opposition on nuclear and on CCS going to block this agreement or not?
Yeah, I think the nuclear is understandable, but how come the CCS?
Yeah,
because I know that in Europe, the phase out or phasing down the fossil fuel or coal has been somehow in trouble. So in that sense, it seems CCS is probably the only solution, right? And I also noticed that the Europe already agreed that for the CCS, that will be only applicable to certain area with very limited usage. So even so, still under a lot of pressure that to kick it out still. Why?
Yeah.
Why so?
The technology is considered not to lead to a reduction of CO2 emissions, because obviously people say, and to a certain extent, of course, this is the case. You can go business as usual with the emissions of carbon emissions if you then capture them and store them. A lot of people in Europe are of the idea we should have technologies which lead to a reduction of the emissions and to the disappearance of the emissions. You know very well, Chinte, that we have adopted this European climate law, which says that we should be climate neutral by 2050. And of course, if we continue and if we even would stimulate now carbon capture and storage, then the question is, of course, to what extent is this compliant with this target of being climate neutral by 2050? I can understand the idea and the reasoning that we can be climate neutral if we capture it and we store it so that it doesn't get in the atmosphere. But okay, some people think otherwise. And the fact that the technology itself has not been developing fast enough over the past decade, of course, also has not been helpful. If we would have very nice and clear and well-functioning examples of carbon capture and storage facilities, that certainly would help the case. But we all know that the amount of such facilities is still very limited today.
Yeah, obviously, there will be still a lot of this debate in this regard. And I know that the pro side try to convince the public by saying that, we will only apply in limited area for limited purpose and trying to avoid the possible prolonged the period of phasing out coal, something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And but on the other hand, the con side would say that, well, if you keep doing that, then we'll be just still here and couldn't move forward to phase out the coal. But anyway, I still think that for the time being, especially just like in Taiwan, somehow we already get rid of the nuclear. So in that sense, the CCS might be somehow a very important transition technology in terms of just transition before we can really find something very cost efficient or cost effective technology as a substitute. So I think that might be something we can learn from this act. And also, do you think that could possibly be this act be criticized as a kind of subsidized in the near future by some other countries? Because it's something, it's aimed to promote European technology, right? Especially by categorization. So could that be somehow criticized?
Well,
like in WTO.
yeah. First of all, let me come back to the CCS, Jinte. I think that you are right. I think that this technology has or will have its merit. And looking at the challenges with which this planet is confronted now, my position has always been that we should develop policies which are technology neutral, in a sense that we will need all technologies which are helpful in order to reach the goals. And so excluding technologies which can contribute to realizing the goals like nuclear or CCS is not a wise approach in my view. Secondly, coming to your question, your second question, obviously there is a protectionist element in this whole policy development. And I must say that the COVID crisis and the energy crisis, and now, of course, also the war, Russia-Ukraine, I must say that this, over the past 3-4 years in Europe, really has been a wake-up call, where we have seen that we are depending on many other countries outside the European Union. For example, and I will start with the example that you know best, our dependency on microchips, for example, in a sense that we need them everywhere, but where are they coming from? Well, not abundantly from within the European Union itself. Secondly, our dependency on energy, our dependency on pharmaceuticals, our dependency even on food, our dependency on a number of other energy sources. So all of this has led to a kind of worrying reaction in the European Union, and which then led to what is called the Versailles Declaration, where the French President Macron said, we have to stop this dependency of the European Union on all those other countries outside the Union. We have to make sure that we can rely upon ourselves again. And so this has changed the narrative of the European Union over the past 2 years, I would say, where initially this idea of Macron on European strategic autonomy was criticized. Now, with COVID, with the energy crisis, with the war behind us or still going on, the leadership in Europe, in many countries, is fully on board of this initiative. And of course, this leads to a certain protectionism. But that protectionism also exists in other parts of the world. Look at what our so-called friends in the United States did with IRA, with the Inflation Reduction Act, the protectionist approach that they took on renewables, on other debates in the whole transition to a climate neutral and sustainable society, with giving tax credits for all kinds of things, which were produced in the United States or manufactured in the United States, this has been a blow to the confidence of the European Union that they would never suffer any significant competition from the United States on that. And initially, the European Union reacted heavily and very disappointed to the US IRA Act. And it's only after the US changed its legislation so that also European companies could benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act and the tax credits and subsidies which are included in that act. It was only then that they gave up opposition, because a lot of my colleagues here in Europe, specialized in international trade law, said this is a pure protectionist measure by the United States. We should go to the WTO and ask for the annulment of specific parts of the Inflation Reduction Act because they violate international free trade. And so at the end of the day, the European Union and the United States came to a compromise so that also European companies could benefit. But it's clear that as well in the EU, as in the United States, as in other parts of the world, look at what is happening in Australia, look what is happening in Asia. There is, of course, a kind of pulling back. There is a kind of doubt if this free global trade still will continue, and that probably it's better to protect the own interests at this point in time, which is, of course, a regrettable development. If I look with my 23 universities in the League of European Research Universities, where we act on a global level, all our universities are institutions which act on a global level. And of course, we are leading in a number of technologies which are now at stake. And if we now see that we are confronted as universities with the fact that we need very soon probably government approval before we can continue cooperation with a number of institutions in other parts of the world on specific topics, if we can publish on those technologies still, this is of course not a development that we support, I would say.
Well, thank you. And I think that will be my last question. Dr. Peng would like me to ask you, well, in this sense, in terms of the possible effectiveness of this act in promoting European strategic net zero technology, and also their deployment as well. In terms of this, how do you think the Taiwan should do the same thing or not? Do we need to also pass an act to do this?
I would say she did that. The big difference is that at least you are already a global leader in one of those key technologies that everybody needs, namely the microchips. So I'm not familiar enough with how your position as a country is with regard to a number of other technologies. I know that certainly in the energy sector, you invest heavily nowadays also in offshore wind and things like that. But I would say that certainly for those crucial societal elements like energy supply, food supply, pharma supply, countries have to make their own investigation on how dependent they are from other parts of the world and to what extent that it is desirable to continue in such a very depending situation. I give you one example. When COVID struck, we didn't have any company in Belgium and only a few of them in Europe which were able to produce at high speed mouth masks, masks that we all had to wear. They all had to come from outside the European Union. And so this was one of the first eye-openers, I would say, that such a rich continent like the European Union, for a simple thing like masks and gloves and things like that, was really dependent from companies outside the European Union. And so Europe has looked into all kinds of other things and saw that it was tremendously dependent on several things, which is, of course, at the end of the day, not so desirable. So I don't know enough about Taiwanese industry in all those sectors to see how dependent that the Taiwanese society is on all kinds of things for producers, importers, manufacturers from outside of Taiwan. But I think that what we experienced in Europe over the past 2-3 years was really a wake-up call that, okay, we don't have to do everything. For example, on the raw materials, we cannot extract what is not there, but at least for a number of those raw materials of which we know that we have them, we should make sure that we use them. And so I think that your country must make the same analysis and take the necessary decisions on the basis of that analysis.
Yeah, well, it's really a good advice. I get the point. In terms of energy, food supply, and the pharmaceutical supply, whether or not we really need to do this, that should depends on a accurate analysis, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe we should start from the analysis first.
Yeah.
And not just leave that to some kind of the imagination or impression.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we do import
not
lots of the energy. We do import lots of energy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to pass the act to do something like yours.
Yeah.
So we need to take a lot of other elements or factors into consideration.
Yeah.
Okay. Any of our audience here would like to raise questions? Oh yeah, Dr.
Okay, yeah, Kurt.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you again.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have a very nice talk, and I think there were two issues. So one is when the Repower EU, and also you have the Net Zero Industry Act from the European Union. Lots of my friends working for the European offshore wind farm industry stop the investment in Taiwan because the EU have lots of the funding for that. So they go back to EU. So that's the situation right now. Not everyone, but maybe 30% or 40%. So I think the Industry Act Net Zero, I think is quite good for EU. But what I think is another issue is it's just like a chip war. In US, and lots of countries, they have the CHIP Act. So such is kind of the Net Zero Industry Act. Is it the same? We can copy it to the energy.
Yeah.
Can we say that?
Well, to start with your last point, it's clear that also in Europe, we adopted this CHIP Act. And that was the first act, in fact, which came out of this evaluation that I just mentioned that the European Union did. Namely, the fact that on microchips, we are so dependent on the rest of the world that we are now going to do major investments. Billions of euros are going to be poured into this industry. And so it's clear that the States has done the same. Australia is on the same track, that a number of big players worldwide are really choosing for domestic production, because domestic production is safety, is certainty, is guarantee of supply, and things like that. Coming back to your question of offshore wind energy operators pulling back from Taiwan and other parts of the world because of the Net Zero Industry Act, I don't think, but I'm not fully, I'm not a specialist on the issue, but I at least don't see so many companies coming back to Europe, because in Europe for the moment, we have a crisis in the offshore wind industry because the cost benefit analysis for a lot of projects at this point in time is absolutely not positive. A number of big players in Scandinavia, in continental Europe, have been experiencing enormous losses over the past few months because of the fact of raising prices for the stuff that they need to produce all those windmills. And at the same time, huge energy costs, huge financial costs and things like that. So in Europe, the situation is a little bit strange. In a sense, we need massively to invest in renewable, in offshore wind energy, but at the same time, a number of very big players in the sector, I'm not going to say that they are at the edge of bankruptcy, but they are experiencing enormously difficult times. And so in that sense, I would be surprised if this Net Zero Industry Act now is going to make a huge difference. Because at the same time, don't forget that in Europe, we also have to comply at the end of the day with competition and state aid rules. And obviously, competition and state aid rules have been, let's say, softened in order to make sure that the necessary investments in the whole energy revolution and transition that we need to make that possible. But still, at the end of the day, there are some basic principles which still have to be respected. So I would be surprised if this pulling back from Taiwan or this pulling back to Europe is so much driven by this Net Zero Industry Act, because obviously also at the end of the day, the whole question is if the European Union is also going to be able to finance all of this. The European Union at this point in time is in a difficult situation financially and is asking all its member states to contribute additional billions and billions of euros in order to make sure that the European Union can deal with the energy crisis, with the migration crisis, with the climate crisis, with the war in Ukraine, where we urgently have to transfer 50 billion euros by the end of next month also. So there are a number of enormous financial constraints on the EU that the whole question at the end of the day will also be if all those commitments which are put forward and all those promises which are made are in fact also realistic.
Okay, thank you. Because Kurt is leaving soon, so you will be the last question. Here will be my student and also attorney, Xie. And he just used the similar name to our English friend, Zen. he also go by Zen. Okay. Okay, you have the floor.
Okay.
Last question. Yeah.
Okay, last question. Thank you, Professor Kurt. And you just slow my question. My first question, you just slow. And in COP28, the IREA and the GREA proposed a proposal to triple of the capacity of the renewable energy installations and double of the energy efficiency in 2030. I think it seems a difficult thing to do. What does the Professor Kurt think? Is there any way we can achieve it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you touch a good point, Zen, in a sense that it's very easy for policymakers, be it at UN level in Dubai, be it at European level, the European Union, to come up with all those targets. Chinte and his colleagues who follow the European situation from close by know how many times now the EU has been changing its policy targets, its percentages for cutting CO2, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and things like that. So one of my buzzwords over the past decade probably has been that there's a kind of fetishism for figures at the level of the UN and at the level of the EU with regard to everything that has to be done to realize this energy transition. And it's clear that the targets are enormously challenging for the short period of time that we have. For example, in Europe, realization of minus 55% of CO2 emissions by 2030, well, I think that this is simply impossible, because also the investments that are need in technology and innovation, those investments are not there. Earlier this week, a paper from the Spanish presidency of the EU was leaked, in which it said, shouldn't we cut in our search for money, shouldn't we cut the research and innovation budget for Horizon Europe, the big RNI funding program? Shouldn't we cut that budget with $5 billion, with 5 billion euros, knowing that this whole strategic autonomy in energy, in pharma, in microchips, in all kinds of net zero technologies is going to be realized only thanks and through new investments in research and innovation. And if you then see at the end of the day with what kind of ease suddenly budget cuts of 5 billion euros are decided just like that, then this makes me doubt how realistic all of this is. Of course, we need incentives for politicians to do what they have to do. The question is, where does it become irrealistic, and where does it become counterproductive to juggle with all kinds of targets and timelines, which at the end of the day are not realistic anymore?
Okay, thank you very much. I think time is about run out, and I think you are ready to rush to another appointment.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much for your appearance and give us such a great and fruitful speech. So I think it's about the end of our the session, and I wish you have a nice evening. Okay.
Thank
See you
you very
soon.
much, and pleasure to have joined you this afternoon. Thank you, and see you soon again.